Tagwe, Tituno, Kena, Atiano, Yerman, Arawak, Daka, Diri, Claudia Foxtree, Daka Diri, Takinaru, Daka Diri, Yuka, Yukei, Guinia, Kauai Daka Iaha. Greetings. My name's Claudia Foxtree, and I introduced myself in the Taino language, which is one of the Arawak languages, and I am Arawak. They are the original people from the Caribbean. I introduced my tribal community and the indigenous name that was given to me in ceremony, which means woman who teaches. Wasn't a huge surprise, other than that was the name that was picked. I'm also with the United Confederation of Taino People and the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness. I use she, her, hers. I am currently speaking to you from the land that was a praying village named Shawshin. And the region is currently known for the Shawsheen River, and the original caretakers were the Pennacook Confederacy. And currently it is, the caretakers are the Wamasett descendants. They were the first to make homes, raise families, plant gardens, find medicine, and many other firsts that go unrecognized. I point this out because we're going to be talking about being unrecognized and being made invisible. And at this point, I'm going to go into my slide presentation. If you signed up, you already saw this particular summary, which was what the workshop's going to be about. I'm hoping by the end of here that you'll have some knowledge of curriculum change, specifically by the work of James Banks. He created this model about 30 years ago, has adapted it since, and many folks have adapted his work in the ongoing way that multicultural curriculum development has been made into culturally responsive teaching and has been anti-racist. I hope that you have some strategies for having difficult conversations, some techniques for creating culturally responsive classrooms, and a deeper understanding of Native American, First Nations, Indigenous people contributions. I did an acknowledgement of the land where I was, and I also want to acknowledge that this land of Massachusetts has many different nations who have been the caretakers. And when I talk about Indigenous people, that I do talk about all of North and South America, and it also includes Greenland, even though it's not labeled in this particular map. And I do refer to colonization and genocide. If you look at the map on the bottom right, you can see that the land here was of the United States, just the United States part, was 100% Indigenous people. And then as laws got passed, or events happened, like the gold rush, the Missouri Compromise, the Revolutionary War, etc., more land was taken. And where there was once 100% Indigenous people, the last census said that we had 2% Indigenous people. I fully expect when we get the next census, that number to rise without additional births. And that is because more people are claiming their Indigenous ancestry. I also want to point out that the map in the upper right has Boston in the center of it, and its original name is Shawmut. That's where I was born and where I had all of my college education, or most of my college education. At one point, I was out in Nipmuc land in Fitchburg. I also want to place myself in this conversation in that I have had relative privilege in that I am college educated. My parents were college educated, and I own my home. Well, the bank does, but you know what I mean. And that I have certain relative privileges to other Indigenous people, like being able to turn on my faucet and have water that I can drink and use for cooking and that kind of thing. Whereas places like the Navajo Reservation have been so polluted by things such as uranium mining that they have to have water trucks come in weekly for fresh water. So you can imagine in a pandemic where you need to wash your hands frequently, that this is highly problematic. When we have discussions or you have it on the chat or we talk afterwards or during, I have 4 guidelines for our community building together. One is to be curious and to ask questions, and yes, we're gonna make mistakes. To hold on to multiple realities, that 2 things can exist at one time. Not knowing anything about Indigenous people can exist at the same time as there's a lot of stuff about Indigenous people, and we just haven't learned enough of it yet. So that's what I mean in terms of the context. As we learn more information, our realities change. Please stay the course. We're all learning. I don't even know everything about every Indigenous nation. That would be impossible. So I'm sharing what I do know and what I've learned from doing presentations that people like to know. And I ask you to speak from your own experiences. And while we heard our hosts, thank you for hosting, our moderators, talk about waiting till later for some of the more personal questions, I'm going to still ask that we not name people and places directly in terms of trying to keep confidential some of the issues that might come up. I also want to express in this moment gratitude that a particular team in Washington, D.C. has decided after many years and pressure to change their name this morning. So that is really exciting news across what we say is Indian country. In terms of the guidelines, I both am thinking with students, I tend to use one of these graphics, like how deep is the mud? Depends on who you ask. We all go through the same stuff differently. So someone can say, I've never thought about racism, it doesn't affect me, and someone else can say, I have that experience every single day. I'm gonna start by a video. It's about 5 minutes long, and time is precious in these kinds of webinars, so I think that it does frame some of the conversation and is important enough to share. Whoops, guess I need to make sure I get it going.
Why don't you people just get over it?
Why don't you people just get over it?
Why don't you people just get over it?
I've heard that for most of my life. Over the course of the next few minutes,
we'd like to answer that question.
Let's go back to when all of this started.
Before the year 1492.
Before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, there were complex systems of government, trade, agriculture, and spirituality.
On both sides of the ocean.
On both sides of the ocean.
On the side that we refer to as Turtle Island,
what is more commonly referred to as North America.
It is estimated that we were as many as 20 million Indigenous peoples.
The Europeans knew nothing about us.
And we knew nothing about them.
Then Christopher Columbus got lost.
And so it began.
And in this new beginning, things weren't so bad. We learned from each other and traded goods that we both needed.
We taught Europeans how to survive in the new world.
We were guides.
We shared our foods.
Corn, squash, beans, potatoes.
We shared our medicines.
We shared the land.
We signed peace and friendship treaties.
That were about, well, peace and friendship. We fought wars together as allies.
Some of us fought with the French.
Some of us fought with the British.
And after the British were victorious on the plans of Abraham,
things began to change.
They wanted to segregate us from the thousands upon thousands of immigrants who were coming to the new colonies.
So they started to push us from our traditional territories onto reserves.
In the West, we were left with little choice.
The Hudson Bay Company killed all the buffalo.
We were starved onto the reserve.
In Upper and Lower Canada, they wanted to sign more treaties.
Not treaties about peace and friendship, but treaties about land ownership and title.
That forced us onto the reserve.
As time wore on, they kept coming back for more.
More land for settlers.
More land for mining.
More land for forestry.
More land for oil.
And as time wore on, we continued to resist.
So the colonizers switched tactics. Instead of segregation, they tried to assimilate us into their society and culture.
They passed laws such as this one in 1857, an act to encourage the gradual civilization of Indian tribes.
Or this one in 1869.
Act for a gradual enfranchisement of Indians. And then, in 1876, the most racist piece of legislation of them all, the Indian Act.
Duncan Campbell Scott, head of the Department of Indian Affairs, said it all.
I want to get rid of the Indian problem.
These laws had a tremendous impact on our people.
If an Aboriginal woman married a non-Aboriginal man, she lost her identity.
If we went to universities, we lost our identities.
If we served in the armed forces, we lost our identity.
We weren't allowed to perform our ceremonies like the potlatch.
Which was our way of sharing our things equally.
And then they did the unthinkable. They took away our children. They took away our children.
The residential school system was an attempted act of genocide against my people.
And still, we resisted.
We fought back.
And we're still here.
Remember when I said they starved us onto reserves?
Today, they're trying to starve us off the reserves.
They're trying to make life in our communities unbearable.
In every measure, Aboriginal peoples fare much worse than other Canadians.
We have a shorter life expectancy.
We have higher levels of poverty. 1 in 4 Aboriginal children live in poverty.
We have higher rates of suicide.
We are 4 times more likely to contract tuberculosis.
Our diabetes rates are 3 times higher than the national average.
42% of our children lack basic dental care. 116 First Nations communities are currently under boil water advisories.
We represent only 2.7% of the adult population in Canada.
But 18% of the federal prison population.
Our high schools receive $2,000 less per student per year than provincially funded schools.
Nearly 600 Aboriginal women have been murdered or have gone missing.
In the last 15 years.
These are the reasons we can't, we won't just get over it.
I am an Indigenous person.
I'm an Indigenous person.
And I'm a union member.
And I'm a union member.
And we think it's time to take the next step forward in the relationship between Canada and Aboriginal peoples.
It's time for Canada to stop its attempts to assimilate us into the general population.
It's time to walk down the path of reconciliation.
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 Please join us.
Join the Justice for Aboriginal Peoples campaign.
So even though this was about Canada, hold on, let me get back to, I have to, this may or may not work. Whoops, didn't want to do that. Sorry, I seem to be able to get into videos easily, but not out of them because I can't get back to present. So I will just do that quickly. I chose it even though it was about Canada because so many of those statistics are also related to the United States. Is my screen showing? I know it's loading, but is the right screen loading? Is that the right one, I hope?
It looks like it.
Thanks. So I'm going to catch back up to where we were. Some people think, oh, Canada is doing it right. Well, they're not just doing it right. They have issues just like the United States does. The United States has had Truth and Reconciliation Councils, most notably in Maine and exemplified in the film Dawnland. So that is one difference. Another difference is that there are more educational programs, more orders to do the Indigenous education in Canada than there is in the United States. So there are some similarities, some differences. Also, Canada continued its boarding schools way longer than the United States, and the United States stopped in 1978. So Stephanie Freiberg has done a lot of work on invisibility, and she says that Native people are generally omitted from the discussions of the discrimination, and because of that invisibility, we are also not discussed in the conversation of race, racism, stereotypes, police brutality, or any of the other issues where generally our percentages are higher than other groups, per capita. So if you compared African American police brutality to indigenous people's police brutality, there would be more African American examples. However, there is a larger percentage of indigenous people. And the case just recently where Oklahoma was part of the land was, quote, given back by treaty rights, that was specifically about the police. So they're not actually getting physical land, they're getting the policing rights back for that territory in Oklahoma, because so many indigenous people are being killed and arrested. They're not releasing people from jail, but they want to have rights to be able to make some of those decisions or be involved in some of those decisions. Maps, when we use them in our school systems, immediately present some invisibility. This first big map here from 1650 it shows you some of the indigenous territories. You can pick any map. I just found one of them that had indigenous territories on it. And then when you look at this other map, which is an 1804 map, you can see that immediately as states start to get constructed, all of the indigenous names and nations and territories are made invisible. So from the east to the west, they start to become invisible. Another manifestation, and another thing about maps is they teach about language of invisibility. So look, when you say America, this is what you're talking about. But when you say this is the USA, this is what you're talking about. And so just be clear when we're using the language of America or the states, we want to keep visible that there's actually more people here than just there. And Manifest Destiny is a really good example of that east to west. We often talk about this image in our classrooms where Native people are being driven off and are only existing on the right in the dark, and the light is coming behind this figure. So we want to create some narrative change. And this picture is real. It wasn't edited. If you have an idea, I can't see the chat, but take a moment to write in the chat about what you think is happening in this image. Again, it's a real picture and it wasn't edited. So how is this rock floating in air? So narrative change means bringing in other perspectives. So that was this image flipped upside down. So it's a rock in a waterbed, right? So how do you bring in that other perspective? And narrative change is a way to create cognitive dissonance. It is by wondering what just happened that makes our brain work to create the neurons that'll make new pathways for new understanding. So it demands us to look at dominant narratives and to change them and reframe them with the new information that we're going to get. So we can't always just change that by saying it. We have to look at our hearts, at our minds, and tap into relationships and other means to make it stick in our brains and to start to get it going. So here's a cute cartoon, not teaching students about the historical injustices of indigenous people face as a result of colonialism is conscientious erasure of history that benefits the government. Well, it benefits the dominant society. So colonization is when the dominant group or system takes and extracts from the land and the people. And often we think of it only in one way, so I want to challenge us to think of it in two ways. Decolonization is for colonizers to dismantle the structures that perpetuate the bias. So that means taking down statues that are perpetuating stories from one perspective. So taking down statues of Columbus, taking down statues of women holding scalps in their hands, for example. For colonized groups, decolonization includes getting their own information and culture back, reclaiming those traditions and worldviews. So for indigenous people, it means valuing that we had knowledge and approaches and weeding out, getting rid of the settler biases, because we've grown up in the same environment as everyone. So we've internalized some of those negative perspectives about ourselves. Reclaiming what was taken and honoring what still remains. So in many of our cultures, we have language that remains, or at least bits of language. We have ceremonies, and we have other kinds of belief systems about relationships. So restoring the Indigenous world view for us. Decolonization, in short, I wanted to make some bulleted list. It's unlearning stories that have only been told from one perspective. It's examining our own beliefs about non-dominant people. You can see some of those beliefs in our founding documents, our so-called founding documents. For example, in the Declaration of Independence, it says merciless Indian savages. Now, if that doesn't show beliefs, I don't know what else does. We need to acknowledge the systems that are perpetuating the beliefs. So that could be the laws, it could be those documents, it could be things happening in your town about beliefs of what statues should stay. It means, or what mascots should stay. We have to recognize it's an ongoing process. We need to create some positive spaces that are inclusive. And so that might be affinity groups, it might be hiring staff of color, teachers of color. It means replacing the Western interpretation of the history of the northern and southern continents on this land. And I think I've covered what's on here. So I have this picture here of an iceberg. You might have seen it before, and you can write in the chat, or you can just write on your own piece of like a notepad or note paper that you might have here. And if you look at above the iceberg, you know, they say that about 10% is showing and the rest is underneath, and it's often used as an example of culture. So when you think of the white American culture above, how much of the above the iceberg do you know? How much, what's the appropriate dress? What's the history? What's the literature, food, crafts, dance, games, language, the national anthem, the flags, holidays, music, heroes? And that's just the visible, like somebody can see it or can feel it by what days we have off. And how much do you know about what's under the iceberg? And I happen to know a lot of what's under because I've grown up in this culture, right? So I know like concepts of time and notions of what's courtesy and communication styles, and like shake a hand when you meet someone or alter it in our current time frame. So think about that, and give yourself in your head your own percentage. How much of this do you know about white American culture above and below the water? So get that number in your head. Now, what do you know about indigenous nations above and below the water? And if your percentages are not the same, think about why that is. If you've just recently moved to the United States, that may be a reason that you don't know as much about either group above or below. If you've lived here all your life, or your recent ancestors have lived here, and you know a lot more about one or the other, that could be a reason why. And if you don't, how are you going to get that information? Because this is the land we are living on. So in order to empathize with someone's experience, you must be willing to believe them as they see it, and not how much you imagine their experience to be. This is a project, it's another short video that was research done by Illuminative over a 2-year time period. And I do have a graphic on the next slide. Let me check my time. I'm gonna skip the video. Am I gonna skip it? 3, 4? Oh, I got plenty of time. I'm gonna show the video again, and we're gonna hope I can get back easily. Here we go. Whoops, didn't work again. There it is.
What I feel real bad for is Indians. Welcome. Welcome. They get dogged openly because everybody thinks they're dead.
Indians don't talk like that.
They're not all dead, all right?
The idea of invisibility and non-representation is, I think it's a little complicated.
Yes, they fought savagely, for they were a primitive people, and self-preservation is a primitive instinct.
I think representation isn't so much on Native people, it's how non-natives view natives.
House, not TP, like a house.
The Native women were very hypersexualized and romanticized. So I think that affects us in academics to just everyday life. They expect you to fit into this form that they would like, and when you don't, they silence your voice.
When it comes to mainstream media, we have this one narrative of history, but every culture has their narrative of history.
That diminishes our youth self-esteem because they're like, what's the point?
It seems like it's designed to devalue us as Native peoples.
If you never see a Native person portrayed as a human, a normal human, and you never meet one, 2% of the people are Native. Every time I see them, they're on TV talking magic talk, then you don't see them as human. It's easier to perform a crime on someone that you think is not human.
If you're always having misconceptions like mirrored back to yourself, then it's harder to get a grasp on your identity, or it tells you that your identity is invalid.
It's tough for me to even really imagine this system sort of valuing other cultures, I guess.
When we see ourselves or our perception of what society thinks of us on TV or the radio or in mascots and whatever the case is, that we automatically feel like we have to be in that slot, like we're automatically seen as that, and so might as well be that.
To add value to our people would be to have people involved as far as designing a society that we all get along in and that we all can share truths about each other instead of propaganda.
The worst that could happen is people would stop hating people for no reason. And if that's all that happens by getting rid of negative stereotypes, that would be great, but there's so much more.
I wonder if we need to get out in the world and actually have human conversations and ask people who don't look like us and don't think like us and don't live near us how they interpret the world.
All right. Well, yeah, I definitely feel like education is important, and I want my children to grow and get great educations. Whenever I was able to get out and and learn and read and research on my own, it does make you resentful. It makes you feel like, dang, can I even trust y'all with my kids because there's so much left out.
People are ready to hear our stories. People are ready to learn about our cultures.
By using story and injecting Native people into story that humanizes them, that makes them just another person in a story and not stand out because of their nativeness.
Oh, it's really important that we work together for new narratives. We have so many opportunities, and it's really beautiful seeing Indigenous people be seen and heard and uniting with all of us, just telling our stories and sharing through our histories.
So the research that this group did found that the bad news is that most Americans feel that what they learned or that's been teaching at school is not accurate, and they strongly support, well, that's the good news, that they strongly support curriculum change. And that other things they found in here was that most people didn't even know any person who was an Indigenous person in their own life. And on the other hand, 78% want to learn more. So there was a both of what do people want to learn, which is the positive, and what has been a problematic area. Books have been a huge problem in that most only talk about Indigenous people in the way back past. If you want more information about book analysis, James Lowen's book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, is an analysis of a bunch of textbooks, a lot of which are in whatever edition and still being used today. And it has the Indigenous perspective of what is being taught. It has other ones as well, and what isn't being taught, and that's not much different than it is today. Now we're going to look at James Banks' work, and while I'm using Indigenous people as an example of the invisibility and the need for putting in other narrative change and perspectives, it actually applies to any group that's underrepresented, and this model itself absolutely applies to all kinds of groups. So if you look at children's books, and this is not that old, half of them have white main characters, 27% have animals or other non-people kind of characters, which only leaves 25% to be split and 1% being Native American. So even that piece of the work by itself, how can we influence change there? Well, we can refuse to buy books. So where's our line? We can refuse to buy books that don't have accurate representation. Fill in the blank. We can refuse to watch movies that don't have accurate representation. We can refuse to binge watch a television series that doesn't have accurate representation. We actually have quite a bit of power, and the changing of that Washington football game's name was because of the pressure of advertisers. And advertisers are pressured by people buying their stuff. So we have more power and control than we think we have. We can also purchase from the Indigenous bookstores, etc. So in his model, the first step in curriculum transformation is no transformation at all. It is the white European American perspective, and these are some examples of what that looks like. And you can see that this table of education is a literal square with one perspective at the head of the table and nobody else invited to the table. When we expand it a bit, we get into important contributions. So usually it's a day or an individual person, the white European American perspective, and I might even add cisgender, heterosexual, male in many of these examples, is the dominating perspective, and other perspectives that are safe are brought to the table. So to bring in a perspective of a woman, you might bring in Eleanor Roosevelt or Rosa Parks. You might talk about Chinese New Year. You know, you bring in these safe people. Squanto, Sacagawea, and Pocahontas have something in common other than being Indigenous and other than being interpreters. They also helped the dominant white European. They are not the Indigenous leaders and people who helped the Indigenous people. So only the safe ones that did something that helped Europeans are brought in to the table of education. The additive approach is basically looking at, for a longer amount of time, at particular groups. So instead of an individual person or a day, you might have a whole week or a month where you're exploring these regularly. You might have a grade level that's doing one or more of these every year, but I'm talking about the entire K-12 curriculum. Who's doing what? I appreciate that there are months that are called heritage months, because at least there are months, and we are not at the place where we can get rid of months because we aren't doing it regularly enough in all of our curriculum. So at least there's the month to fall back on at this point. And when he says that the table is transformed, he literally means it's not a square table anymore. And that in the non-literal sense, it is a round table with everyone's perspective somewhat equally represented. Now, when you transform your curriculum, you may not be bringing in 8 new perspectives at a time, because we can only start with what we can start with. So you might bring in 2 or 3 perspectives and slowly work yourself up to the number you want. And perhaps for one unit, you're going to do the 2 or 3 or 4 perspectives. And for the next unit, you're going to do another 2 or 3 or 4 perspectives. So however you plan to do your transformation, this is about the perspective. So bringing in different points of view.
I couldn't stop it.
On your table. I hear somebody in the background. Is there a question? All right, I'm going to move on. So I picked Thanksgiving here, and I put up a couple of different examples of ways you could transform the perspective on Thanksgiving. So if you're new to this country, you might not know what this Thanksgiving thing is. And if you're not new, it only takes a couple of years to figure out what it is, because it's all around in like the grocery stores and the comedies you're watching on television. It's in movies. So eventually you pick up what this is. And it is a mythological story about the first time that the settler colonial people known as the Pilgrims had a harvest. So it wasn't the first year they arrived in November. So it was the following year after they had planted with the help of their indigenous neighbors. It's the mythological story proceeds that they had a harvest festival, and the indigenous people, the Wampanoag, were invited, and they sat down and they had this great feast to celebrate. So this particular transformed perspective gives a little bit more to it. For example, Sarah Josepha Hale, who you may or may not know her name, you most certainly know what she is most famous for, which is the little song called Mary Had a Little Lamb. She petitioned Abraham Lincoln for a national holiday and had a lot to do with making Thanksgiving what it is today. Looking at what is Pilgrim in terms of the clothing and what they did is important, because that also is related to the fact that they considered indigenous people heathens and savages, and therefore would not have had a religious anything, and they considered Thanksgiving religious with them. So their ceremonies and celebrations wouldn't have been shared and called that if it was with indigenous people. There are other examples like the history of Tisquantum, which people know as Squanto. He was captured and enslaved off the coast of Maine and brought to Europe, where he spent 5 years before returning and finding his entire village of Patuxet erased from a plague, and long story short, did reach out to the Pilgrims. So I'm just giving a couple different perspectives. I will be giving you a link to a site with resources, and these perspectives are in that resource in documents or videos or something like that. So if you wanted to do something on your own in creating a transformed perspective about Thanksgiving, you could do that. I'm going to say that word Patuxet again. Patuxet is the original name of Plymouth. You are going to hear a lot about Patuxet if you're from Massachusetts, and that is because Plymouth Plantation, which is a bicultural exhibit of colonial settlers and in the past recreated, and indigenous people in the present doing their thing, actually cooking food and skinning animals and planting gardens and that kind of thing. They are renaming themselves in honor of the 400-year anniversary, which is 1620 is the arrival, 1621 is that so-called Thanksgiving. And they are using the Plymouth Patuxet as their placeholder until they announce the new name that they're going to be using. And that piece we just went through is only the top part of the model that James Banks developed. The top part is content integration, bringing in the multiple perspectives. He goes on to say that in order to have, he used it as multicultural, to become a multicultural leader. We wouldn't use that in today's language of this work. We might call it culturally responsive teaching and include the whole thing. We might call it anti-racist education and include everything. It really doesn't matter what you call it, as long as you do these 4 things. So however you call it, like I said, Banks called it multicultural leaders. It includes content integration of bringing in the perspectives. It includes a pedagogy that is culturally responsive. So it includes the way that we are teaching that reaches all students. It includes a knowledge construction. You might call that the anti-racist part. It's the part where we're talking about power and privilege. Whose story is being told, whose story is not being told, who is benefiting from not telling that story. What does it tell us about the history? What does it tell us about the resistance? What does it tell us about what's going on now? So that those three pieces, and then the fourth piece is looking at structural change. So actually looking at the school and seeing that all students have access to higher level education. All students are included in that education, that there's conversation about racism, stereotypes, and prejudice, the actual language needed to have the conversation. So if you are doing all those parts, doesn't really matter what you're calling it, as long as you're doing those pieces to it. And so that was one of his motivating things about what is a multicultural leader. Another way he put it in short is that equity education requires us, and he added this a few years later, to know, to care, and to act. So again, we talked about how it's important to do the heart piece and to do the neurons in our brain piece. And then there are the actions of actually making the change in our curriculum, in our classrooms, in our school, whether it's the school culture, the teaching strategies, or the content of our curriculum. I'm going to go back to just looking at Indigenous people. More people see stereotypes than authentic images. This is one of the huge problems with the mascotting. And I use mascotting or masketry because it is more than just the image. It is the people dressing up. It is the songs. It is the music that high school bands play. It is the symbols that they do, that high schools do or teams do, holding tomahawks, in this case, holding the head of somebody in the first-hand image. If you look down in the bottom left, it say, hey, Indians, get ready for the Trail of Tears. You know, we wouldn't say that about another group's horrific history. You know, we wouldn't, I don't even want to repeat an example for that. You could pick any group that's been oppressed and imagine putting their exact oppression on a sign at a football game where all high school students and their families are seeing it. So mascotry and mascotting is more than just that image. It's all the other pieces that go with it. And then you can see celebrities and others dressing up. When we talk, you know, cultural appropriation is when a dominant culture takes on characteristics or dress of other groups. That bottom image, you may or may not notice, is the Boston Tea Party. So this has been historical in Massachusetts for centuries now. The Sons of Liberty dressed up as their local Indigenous folks, and nobody thought that was Indigenous people dumping tea into the harbor. No one. Everybody knew who it was. So they dressed up for some other reason. There's a great book called Playing Indian, which explains this particular history, and also how it continues through summer camps, Boy Scouts, other places that do it pretty regularly, and describes it as a way to sort of pretend to be like what you think that group is. So if you think that group, meaning the Indigenous people, are wild and risk takers and willing to do anything out of the norm, then you take on that persona of what you believe they are and dump tea or whatever it is. So he goes on to talk about that. On the right hand are some films that, again, more stereotypes and authentic images, just to point out some of the problematic aspects. The top one has totem poles and teepees together, and those two things do not exist in the same nations. Underneath, you see Pirates of the Caribbean with the stereotype of folks being cannibals, right? And then you have the dressing up for Halloween. So, you know, you may, or some of this may be new, you may not even be thinking about this. I'm asking you to think about, where's your line? You know, what are you willing to buy, patronize, go to, knowing that it is stereotyping another group? in this case, Indigenous people, but it could be any group. You know, where's your personal line? I had a line that I didn't buy certain companies' products because I knew that they had, were treating their employees terrible or had a history of putting out racist clothing, let's say. I didn't buy their products. And then my house burned down. It was an accidental electrical fire, and the next day I didn't have a toothbrush. My line definitely changed. At that moment, I had 5 kids, three still in high school, and the schools, the police department, the town started collecting clothing because we needed stuff. And fortunately, nobody was killed. I want to also say that in the fire, nobody died. I lost a cat, and the other cat did not die. But in it were clothing from these companies that I did not patronize, but I used it because I didn't have anything, and so I had to. And at different points in our lives, our line may change. So now that we're becoming more aware, we may start saying to our schools, I know we don't have one of those mascots, but don't we have contests with schools that do? Why are we doing that? Can we not meet with schools that do? I mean, where's your line? Where are you gonna say, we're not gonna do that? So these are, you know, things I've learned, ways to take some action, and ways to put pressure on organizations that have more power. So stereotypes are up here on the upper right. When we look at the cycle of oppression, which is the original name, I like to call it the cycle of advantage and disadvantage because it is advantaging some groups, simultaneously disadvantaging the other groups. If you take those stereotypes and then you add to it the prejudice, which is the judgment about those stereotypes, I'm going around the circle clockwise, and then it leads to discrimination, where you have a judgment that that person isn't going to be a good boss or a good employee or whatever it is, and then you actually do the discrimination. That's what causes the oppression, and it gets internalized by both the dominant culture and the culture that's been colonized or is being oppressed in this cycle. And it is only through that cognitive dissonance, learning other stories, having more examples than just the stereotypes, that we start to change our mind and can get on an anti-racism track or get off of this cycle. As Beverly Daniel Tatum says, it's like that we're on an escalator, and the escalator is continuing this cycle of advantage for some and disadvantage for others. We can make a conscious choice as we're on that escalator and said, I am not gonna do that anymore, and turn around. But guess what? You are still going on that escalator, which is why being non-racist is not enough. We need to be active. We need to be anti-racist, because you're gonna have to work really hard to walk or run down the escalator and get off of it and go into a different path. And it is constantly pulling us back to get onto it. So when we look at racism, in the past, it has been defined in somewhat of a, I'm not racist, I'm not mean, I'm a nice person. Well, racism is not individual acts of meanness. Racism is systemic, and it is institutionalized, and it is working at multiple levels. So it is not just personal. It also includes the social norms, the cultural things, what we do see, what we don't see, and the institutions. So who has power, meaning who's making the laws, who's making the textbooks, what are religious institutions doing, what, you know, so institutional, and it is functioning at all those levels. This works for any ism, not just racism. So the defense of a system from which advantage is derived based on race could be from which advantage is derived based on heterosexuality, based on sex. You know, you can fill it in with anything and it still works. It's when the advantages are at all these levels systematically, and we are defending that system instead of trying to get out of it and be anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-heterosexist, etc. So as Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility, said, and I can't read because this is over it, To continue reproducing racial inequality, the system only needs white people to be really nice and carry on. Smile at people of color, be friendly across race, and go to lunch together on occasion. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be nice. I suppose it's better than being mean, but niceness is not courageous. Niceness will not get racism off the table and will not keep it, and will, niceness will not get racism on the table and will not keep it on the table when everyone wants it off. In fact, bringing racism to white people's attention is often seen as not nice, and being perceived as not nice triggers white fragility. So she wrote about white fragility. It is the next step of understanding what whiteness is. Some people have always had to think about what their race is, and others haven't in the dominant culture. So understanding how whiteness has its own privileges and its own fragility is part of the journey. It's part of the process of getting out of that cycle and off of that escalator. Whoops. So creating cognitive dissonance. We can't replace our narratives right away. We need to learn new things, practice, make mistakes. That's how the brain changes. This should sound familiar. It is what growth mindset is. We've said it over and over that when kids are learning, they have to ask questions, they have to make mistakes. That's how they learn. A 2-year-old that's learning to walk isn't going to fall down and say, that's not for me. They're going to keep trying, you're going to keep coaching, and eventually they're going to learn it, and they're going to build the muscle memory and the neurons that say, this is how I walk. So it becomes automatic. So a way to look at that growth mindset, anti-racism, the fixed comfort to the growth and change. Instead of saying, I don't know where to start or what to say, the growth and courageous piece is, first I'm gonna listen, read, watch, and then I'm gonna speak out against injustice. I don't wanna get it wrong or get called out. Well, think of it as I'm gonna make mistakes, no doubt about it, and I'll be grateful. So thank you for educating me on that. I didn't know it. Which is one of my guidelines, is asking questions. And how am I going to say ask questions if I'm going to yell at you, right? I might get loud and passionate, but I want you to learn. And I want to move us towards the growth mindset. It won't make a difference what I do. Nothing's going to change. Well, you know what? Nothing does change. If you don't do anything, it won't change. If you do something and you take risks, change can come. A lot of things have changed just in the last 3 months by actions. And if you say I don't get involved in politics, remember that this is human rights issues. I've had this particular conversation frequently in the last few months with people saying that they don't get involved in politics, and I don't actually have that option. Politics is part of what follows me around every day of my life. A couple of weeks ago, my picture appeared on a diversity panel, which was a wonderful thing, a diversity panel. But it talked about the panel below the fold of the newspaper. So when the newspaper was folded, all you saw was local police news and my picture and name. So I have to be political. You know, I had to contact the paper, had friends contact the paper and deal with something that was creating a new neuron of Claudia Foxtree under the police blotter instead of Claudia Foxtree as a diversity educator. I want that to be the neurons that are getting developed, the automatic connections. So why are stereotypes damaging? They make one story the only story, and then that becomes a story that everyone learns, and it's often constructed by the dominant culture. The images affect all children. They teach the indigenous children, or whichever group you're talking about, how you're supposed to look, even when it's false. And it also teaches the non-indigenous children. It isn't showing any of the real authentic songs, dance, or stories. So when you do Googling those YouTube videos, look for real indigenous people. And they don't focus on contributions, role models, or resistance. I'm gonna give you an example of when stereotypes go to the extreme. It's a free association. You do not have to write any in the chat. You don't have to admit at all. I do want you to think about what comes to your mind when I say these 4 words. So visualize it, If you make a list in your head and that's easier, go ahead. Winnebago, Pontiac, Sequoia, and the R word known as redskin. You got those 4 images? These are mine. Were they yours? The Winnebago, now known as the Ho-Chunk, are the indigenous people of the Great Lakes area. Pontiac was a leader who was fighting for his own culture to survive, Ottawa people. And Sequoia was a multiracial man who invented an entire language. So you could call him a linguist as well. If he took the Cherokee language, he put it into syllables. That would be like saying taking the American English language and putting it into phonics as opposed to letters. And the syllabary is still the way that the Cherokee language is passed on and written today. And the word redskin is what you would say when you went to your local trading post and you said, I have a beaver pelt, I have some deer fur, and I brought some redskins, which was the scalps of indigenous people. In this case here, it's $200 per scalp. And so that's how much money someone would make maybe in a year. So being able to bring in a scalp for that was very, very lucrative and an economic incentive, not only for non-indigenous people, but also indigenous people. So this is a very, very racist term, and I can't believe that today it's gone from that football team. So yay. So deep breath. So we want to create associations that either have accurate information, well, that definitely have accurate information, and dismantle the inaccurate information. That's when stereotypes become so appropriated and so connected with the dominant culture's view of it that it is no longer respectful or even connected to what the indigenous people did. So this is a friend in my nation. The same way they wrote us out of the history books, we're going to write ourselves back in. So we know her as Naniki, one of our elders. So how do we write ourselves back in? Well, I am going to do it in a culturally responsive way. So we talked about James Bank, it's got the perspectives. We talked about the anti-racism, how you bring in power, who has power to make the stereotypes and continue it. Now we're gonna do a little practice, because culturally responsive teaching, you can't just talk about it, you gotta do it. So I gotta do it with you. There's make it a game, make it social, make it a story. And now that we might be doing our classes online, we really need to get creative of how are we going to do these things where we're still teaching content, and maybe we're teaching it in a social way or a story way or making it into a game. This comes from the work of many people, particularly Zaretta Hammond, who wrote Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. Now, I have an Indigenous Contributions Kahoot that I want you all to try. I'm gonna get us set up, and here's the thing. If you can't get set up, grab yourself a piece of paper or open up a document on your computer and just write down what you think the answers are, and you can later on see if you were right or not. So hopefully everybody can connect, and this is going to work without any huge issues. So I'm gonna make it nice and, big, so I am assuming some people have used Kahoot, but in case you haven't, it is easiest to log on to your phone. You will get 4 colored boxes, and they won't have anything in it, so you have to look at my shared screen. Are you seeing my shared screen with the Kahoot? I hope so.
Yes, we are.
Yes, we are.
Thank you. Thank you. I tried it out before and it was working, so I'm just double checking. And there's going to be a password that you're going to put in. You can also do it on your computer, but you won't see the questions if you don't see the shared screen. So that's why I want to make sure you can see it. So you're going to go to www.kahoot.it. Whoops. And you're going to put in 8209598. I'm going to suggest you put your name, but you could certainly do what my students do, which is, I'm the winner. No, I'm the winner. No, I'm the winner. I don't know how many people this will take in, so we'll see when it says it's got a limit.
I think it lets you have up to 100.
So that would be good. I'm going to give it some time to log all of you in. I'm also going to say that one thing I've learned about doing transforming curriculum, decolonizing curriculum, is once you get rid of all of the inaccurate information, you're cutting it, you're scraping it, you're tossing it, you're taking it out of your curriculum, there's a lot of emptiness. You want to fill it up, fill up the heart, fill up the mind, fill up the spirit with positive things too. Not just the accurate story of Thanksgiving, which is pretty terrible, or the accurate story of Columbus, which is a genocidal, atrocious story. You also want to add positive things, contributions, role models that helped everyone, including Indigenous people. Those are the pieces that you can use. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on this, starting with this game. I don't see more people coming on, which is okay because you can play just writing it down. I'm going to get us started. I know it's, you didn't know this was coming, and you might just be still logging in with your phones. I will tell you that some of these contributions have already come up in the slideshow that I've done, as well as in some of the videos. And so you might know some of the answers. They cross Indigenous nations. They do have a fair amount of Arawak because that's my nation and it was first contact. So a lot of stuff got passed on from that first contact, the language and the things that were inventions, even if the Arawak weren't the original inventors, that's who got associated with it. So there's going to be some of those, and then there's going to be a bunch of other things as well. All right, we only got one more person in that amount of time, so I am going to start. Here we go. What is the Arawak word for a sleeping net invention made of cotton and suspended at both ends? Great, so we started off a little easy. So this invention, again, it was from the Maya most likely, and the Arawak were using it, and that word is an Arawak word, hamaka. So this translated back into Europe. As Christopher Columbus traveled, the Arawak greeted him with what food that became associated with hospitality? I'm just going to keep going. We have some changes in our hierarchy here. What do we call the food based on chicle that was the Aztec first used? Nice. What game had teams that could number in the hundreds and was played on long fields up to half a mile long?
Claudia, we're getting, we have an answer of just basically saying they can't see the green answer.
All right, I'm taking off the, what'd you say?
We have somebody that says they can't read the.
Can you say that again? Because I took off this, whoops. I guess I have to turn on the sound so I can hear you, of course.
Sorry. So we have somebody in the chat just saying that they can't see the green answer. If you can read the answers.
They can't see the answers?
They can't see the green answer specifically.
Okay, so I'll say the green answer?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you for that. What were the Olmec stone channels built to bring water to cities between 1700 and 400 BC used for? And the green answer is pools, if that's the one you want. And I do try to read things out loud. I should have probably read all the answers because I'm a special education teacher in my other life.
Claudia, you might have to just read all the answers. I have somebody else saying that they can't.
I'm happy to do that. Thank you. What is the method of slow roasting meat with seasoning on a rack over a fire invented and named by the Arawak called? The triangle is braising, I can't see that. The circle is barbecue, the diamond is boiling, and the square is grilling. What effective treatment for malaria was first provided by Native Americans? The triangle is ginger ale, the circle is aspirin, the diamond is quinine, and the square is willow bark. We have some movement, but victory is still maintaining the lead. In 1988, the House and Senate passed a resolution recognizing the US government has its roots in what indigenous political system? The triangle is tribal government. The circle is the Iroquois Confederacy. The diamond is a chiefdom, and the square is a city-state. What do we now call the Aztec Neapolitan that used dry corn kernels as counters to calculate transactions? Triangle is receipt, circle is a calculator, marbles is the diamond, and square is the abacus. I'm going to stop here because, you know, we got about 20 minutes left and there's some things that I still want to talk through. So we did have a change in winners at this point. So Sybil, congratulations. You are the top one at this point. I'm going to move back to our slideshow. And you're going to see some of those things again. So one of the things about culturally responsive teaching is that changes of state, like doing something different and novel, helps our brains learn. So the more that we can put that kind of thing into our teaching practices, the more students are going to get engaged all of a sudden, even if they were dropping off. And so I had a lot of different, I didn't have every one of these things in that Kahoot at all, but I wanted to give you an example on these slides of other kinds of language and other kinds of contributions. So this particular slide, I grouped them. They don't naturally go together. I grouped them like this because I wanted to point out that every one of these words and inventions has to do with contact. So it has an Arawak connection. Tapioca is not an Arawak word, but the other four are. And tapioca is from cassava or manioc, and it is from that contact period. Come back on here. The community and games. So anything that's a stick and ball game probably owes its origin to Indigenous people, because Indigenous people did team sports. Other places in the world had games, but they were often things like chess or checkers. They weren't one-on-one kind of games. So the idea of having team sports, and rubber is an Indigenous invention, and therefore if it has rubber and a ball, it is most likely owes its origins to Indigenous people as well, unless there was some other kind of bouncy material available. Economics and politics, we talked about one of the questions was the Iroquois Confederacy. I want to point out that cotton, tobacco, sugarcane, cotton and tobacco were indigenous crops. They were commodified and made part of the triangular trade and part of the impetus of stealing African people from their lands and bringing them to this continent. Sugarcane was one of the first crops that was not indigenous, that was introduced in the Caribbean, and indigenous people were made the slaves to work those plantations. So the practice of doing plantations and of kidnapping people and putting them into servitude, free servitude, known as slavery, was something that got developed at first in the islands, and then it expanded to what we know today. In math, there were many forms of math: zero, abacus, pyramids, and here are just some images to keep thinking about it. There were other people in the world that had a zero, and there were indigenous people. And so we don't have to go outside of this continent to explain these same things that we explain when we talk about them in Egypt or in Greece and Rome. Cleanliness was a huge thing that indigenous people taught the Europeans. And the Wampanoag described being able to tell that the pilgrims were coming from a mile away because they only took a bath once a year. And it was usually in May, and that's when they got married. And if it kind of smelled, they just brought flowers, hence flowers at your wedding. So the idea of taking daily baths and having plumbing and shampoo and deodorant, these are all things indigenous people and other people in the world too were doing, but not the first colonizers in the New England area. Nuts and berries, I love to include nuts and berries because they cover the first fruits of the season and the last fruits of the season. And I'm going to tell you right now that all of you need to read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She talks about the relationship with the land. She tells some of the stories that I'm going to tell you right now, and it feeds your soul and your mind. So strawberries are the first fruit of the season. They're meant to be found. Skip the first one because that's the appropriate hunter-gatherer kind of belief system. You let the first one go, you go to the second patch, and you eat it right on the spot. They're soft. You put them in your mouth, they break, they're meant to be eaten right there. One of the last fruits of the season are our nuts. Nuts are meant to be harvested at the end of the season. They come in a hard shell, you put them in your sack, you take them away, you store them, and then you have some great nutritional nuts to take you through the winter time. Now, she tells a story of the pecans. When indigenous people were relocated, they knew all the nuts and berries in their area, but then they got taken from their lands and moved out to places like in Oklahoma, where it was all a bunch of new nuts and berries. And it's like, oh no, what am I gonna eat? And so they didn't see their hickory nuts anymore, but they saw this other tree, which they called the, I don't know what kind of nut that is, tree, So the unknown nut tree didn't know the name of this nut, which is the word pecan. Means I don't know the name of this tree. And they could still continue to do some nut gathering. Trees and sap, we've got maple syrup, chewing gum, rubber, lots of uses for trees and sap. The earth provides agricultural engineering. So many people talk about the chocolate, the corn, the beans, pumpkins, all these foods that indigenous people brought to the table. And they get talked about at Thanksgiving when not all of them existed even then. But across North and South America, all these foods existing, but they don't talk about the engineering it took. It wasn't like that these were found in the middle of a wilderness fully formed. They were engineered for different latitudes, and they were engineered, like corn is a grass. It's a little grass. It got engineered to be what we think of as corn. So the technology involved in making all these varieties of beans and all these varieties of potatoes and corns that no longer look like grass took a lot more than just finding it in the woods like a strawberry. I want you to take a look at this image. A lot of colonists came and said, you know, they're not farmers, they're not doing the rows and all that, but this is actually a farm. It's a South American farm, and it has been propagated, and plants have been put in there, and it's been moved around so that it has all the uses that you need in one small area. So I challenge you to think about your role as a social change agent. You could be a teacher, but you could also be a healer, an artist, a storyteller, just a bunch of things. And if we look at this circle, you can control a little teeny piece of the pie, and only in the front part of it, the little piece you can control, maybe yourself. You can influence more people, maybe your family, maybe your students. And you can have concern about a whole lot more, but you only have that piece of pie. And so how do you get more out of that circle? You can join other allies, agitators, activists, co-conspirators, and you get more pieces of that pie. And together you get bigger chunks. So doing this work means finding your allies, finding other people who you can do this work with. And I want to point out, and I did this slide, I should have added the Redskins, but here's some change. The Land O'Lakes, which was also something I boycotted, has taken away its Native American person, but the Indian tonic water has not. The Argo has reduced the image, and Eskimo Pie has made an announcement that they are going to change it. So you can think about all the places you may or may not have noticed that there were Indigenous people represented. If you're not going to ever look at the slideshow that's going to be, I mean, not the slideshow, the video that's being currently made, then this is the page you want to take a screenshot of. That tiny URL at the top, First Nations People Anti-Racism Books, FNP Anti-Racism Books, will take you to a list of books for further information, but I put my favorites on here. And down at the bottom, it says teeny URL, Whose History Matters, one word, Whose History Matters. That's all of the resources that, and it links to my blog spot and some other places as well. But there's a bunch of resources in there as well. And I will tell you that I have been doing some work with Debbie Irving, the author of Waking Up White. And just today, if you go to her site, she launched the 21-day challenge for learning about Indigenous people. Eventually, it'll be on the Massachusetts Center for Native American website, but currently it's just on her website. So that is another place that you can get resources. I worked with her on it, as well as some other people. So here I have stuff about contribution stereotypes. I have a novel because it gives some story of Columbus and kind of like a what if this happened? How could it look different? Which I find interesting in terms of envisioning a different kind of future. And so now I will ask you to think about what you will do